Good morning, everyone. So 2 out of the 3 years of the lectionary readings for this Sunday are focused on Mary, which is right and good. But this year is Joseph's year. Joseph, often forgotten about, almost seen as incidental in the birth of Christ, basically someone whose main job is not to mess up the story. There's a podcast I sometimes listen to called A Slight Change of Plans, which tells the stories of people whose lives take an unexpected turn and how they deal with that. For instance, a scientist who researches cancer detection tools on the day he suddenly gets a stage 4 cancer diagnosis. Or the new graduate who was so excited to start work at a cool new startup, but soon found there were problems and had to decide whether to blow the whistle or keep her head down. The company was, by the way, called Theranos. I think Joseph would have made a great candidate for a slight change of plans. The godly young man who lived a quiet life as a carpenter in an unremarkable town, falls for the girl next door, gets engaged, starts integrating the families who probably knew each other really well, and then one terrible day discovered she was pregnant, and it wasn't his, and what's more, she claims the baby apparently somehow was God's. What to do? Where is God in this, other than apparently somehow involved with his fiancée? What we miss in the gospel reading today is what has come just before it in Matthew's account, the genealogy of Jesus. In these times, the genealogy was a big deal, and in this patriarchal society, it always traced the male line. So Matthew details Jesus' genealogy, and it includes the predictable Abraham and David. But then there's an unexpected change of plans, as Jesus' genealogy unusually and shockingly includes 4 women. Tamar, a widow who seduced her father-in-law and became pregnant by him in order to pursue justice for herself. That's a long story. Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who helped the Israelites conquer a city. Ruth, a Moabite, who the Israelites don't like, widow, and Bathsheba, whose husband was murdered by King David so he could marry her after she became pregnant by him. So that's a lot. Then the genealogy ends with Joseph of today's gospel reading. But he is introduced not with the usual Joseph, the father of Jesus, but rather Joseph, the husband of Mary, who was the mother of Jesus. For a man to be introduced as the husband of was unheard of. So this man is different. And those listening to Matthew's account would have immediately noticed that he was different and been alert to the fact that this Joseph somehow is not the father of Jesus, that something weird is happening, and that Jesus' lineage is anything but the perfect Hallmark family picture. In fact, the genealogy of Jesus is shocking, scandalous, and very messy. I hope that brings you some comfort as you head into a week with your family and friends for Christmas. One of the reasons Joseph's unexpected change of plans touches my heart so much is that I spend my days in the jail working with men and women and youth who, like Joseph, are often the more forgotten incidental members of the story, and like him have experienced abrupt, often painful changes of plans in their lives when they end up locked up, their lives upended, their futures uncertain, judged and looked upon by many as at best unlucky, at worst scum. So what to do? Where's God in all this? Even our Old Testament reading echoes this theme. Just prior to the Old Testament reading this morning, you hear about Ahaz, a godly, faithful king, facing a brutal invasion from two neighboring enemies who vow to tear apart his country and plunder it completely. And it leaves them all shaking with fear. So where is God? What to do? What do we all do with unexpected change of plans? I don't know anyone in this room, including myself, who has not faced situations, be they big or small, where life takes an unexpected and not wholly welcome turn. A family situation, a work problem, a health diagnosis, a disappointing relationship, an existential fear about the state of the world and our communities, maybe even disillusionment with God or the church. And it's often this time of year that reminds us of the ways in which our world, our lives, our families are simply not the put-together simple stories we long for and idolize. So what do we do? Where is God? So Joseph, being the good and godly person he was, after absorbing the initial shock, and no doubt a mix of feelings, anger, grief, fear, he doesn't want to impact Mary any more than she is already, so he plans to quietly end the engagement. Under the law of the time, if he had exposed her, she would likely have been stoned to death for adultery. But despite the betrayal, he didn't want her to suffer, so he decided to quietly back off. I wonder what his life would have gone on to be if he had followed through on this. My guess is that Joseph would probably always have been a little hurt, possibly unwilling ever to commit his heart to anyone in the same way ever again. Probably upset with God, or at the very least, suspicious of God. But he would have been quietly backed away from the drama and safer, but probably a lesser version of himself. King Ahaz, in Isaiah's prophecy, facing his version of an unexpected crisis, here's God saying, "I'm with you, Ahaz. Don't be afraid. Ask me for a sign to show you I'm with you in all of this." And Ahaz refuses to ask God for a sign, not wanting to test God. Better not to risk that. Maybe God wouldn't come through if I asked him for a sign. Things are chaotic enough. I shouldn't put God to the test. I'm going to stay quiet and hope for the best in the midst of this chaos. The men and women I work with have a choice to face their own crisis of life and faith, and they're often tempted to withdraw into themselves, their addictions, their old habits, and hide away as much as possible from the situation at hand. That's something we all do, albeit in less obvious ways than those in jail. So Joseph goes to sleep, and he has a dream where this angel appears, and the first words out of the angel's mouth are, "Don't be afraid." And then this angel goes on to encourage him to go through with his marriage to Mary and assures him mysteriously this baby is indeed conceived not by adultery, but somehow through the Holy Spirit. And then all that Matthew says after that is that Joseph acted on this dream, married Mary, and refrained from intercourse till after Jesus was born. I think Matthew skipped a lot, because my guess is that Joseph felt convicted by this vivid, striking dream that God was speaking to him. But my experience of human life is such that I can almost certainly say that there were times when Joseph second-guessed himself. Was my dream merely wishful thinking? Am I just being stupid to believe Mary? Will everyone figure this out and call me a laughingstock? Why can't my life, why can't my family just be the simple, beautiful one I was hoping for? The real Joseph is so much more than the paternal figure in nativity scenes who stands behind Mary and the baby, wistfully gazing and guarding them. He's a real man who had a sense of how his life was going to be, who was really upended by all of this. His life and Mary's would never be the same again when he chose not to quietly back away, but stay and trust and risk. His yes was not just once after a dream, one night. It was every night for the rest of his life, which by all accounts was not easy. It was a yes every time Mary irritated him, or he doubted God, or he thought this story, this dream, this life, it can't be true. It was a yes every time he looked at Jesus and thought, who is this kid really? Joseph, for me, is a hero of faith and a model for all of us as we all face choices to have faith or not have faith, to trust God or not trust God, to stay or go in the face of doubt about who this Jesus really is. The men and women in jail know this all too well. This last Wednesday, I sat with a woman as the funeral for her son, who overdosed on fentanyl, was taking place. She is a Christian. She did not expect her son to die while she was in jail. And as we said the prayers together from the funeral service, she expressed faith that God really is real. And she expressed doubt that God is real at all. And she expressed a need for God and a desire to walk away from God, and it's all legitimate. Our lives and our faith are not Hallmark. They are messy ups and downs, with a choice every day to risk saying yes and stay rather than quietly backing off. Ahaz, Joseph, all of us, what's the end game? What's the end game when we choose to stay? When we face those moments in life where we can press into God or settle for a neutral, watered-down spirituality in life? When we decide not to give up on that troubled relationship, even though it's complicated and will stay complicated? When we choose to risk, to believe that the world can heal and that hope is not just sentimental nonsense? When we choose not to act out of fear, but rather act out of God's promises? What does God give us? Both the Old Testament and the New Testament today end with a reminder that's probably way more important than trying to understand the intricacies of how Mary got pregnant, or what God was thinking, or even how our own situations will work themselves out. In both passages, we hear the promise of God that when we choose to stay in the middle of the mess, Emmanuel, God, is literally with us. Not theoretically, but physically, emotionally, spiritually, right here with you. For Joseph, this took on an extremely literal significance as he welcomed God in a body, aka Jesus, aka Emmanuel, into his home and his life. For you and for me, I don't know what the situations in your life and world are that you're tempted to quietly back off from and not risk getting any more disappointed or hurt by. But I do know there is a promise from God for you that we celebrate at Christmas. That as we say yes to God, you will never face that situation without the power, presence, and love of God right there with you. Today, as you take the Eucharist, I invite you to remember as you eat that God is literally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, absolutely present with you as you choose to risk saying yes. I want to end with a poem that I think could well have been written for Joseph, and maybe for some of you too. It's one of my favorites, especially when the present is messy and the future is unknown. I'll use it as a prayer to end this time. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, "Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown." And he replied, "Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God, and that shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way." So I went forth, and finding the hand of God, trod gladly into the night. And he led me towards the hills and the breaking of day in the lone east.